I came home expecting a quiet evening, but instead I found my suitcases lined up on the sidewalk and a note from my daughter-in-law telling me I could live in the garage. What they didn't know was that I had been secretly paying for the house all along. I came home from a quiet trip to visit my sister expecting the simple comfort of familiarity. A week away had left me craving the small rituals that make a house feel alive. Setting my suitcase beside the door, boiling water for tea, and lowering myself into the old armchair by the window that still held the faint scent of the wood polish my husband Richard used to swear by. But the moment the taxi slowed in front of my house, something inside me shifted. For suitcases were sitting on the sidewalk. My suitcases. They were arranged with a strange kind of neatness, lined up beside the curb as if someone had carefully prepared them for a departure that wasn't supposed to involve the person who owned them. For a few seconds I thought perhaps the driver had brought me to the wrong street. That happens sometimes when neighborhoods look alike. But then I noticed the maple tree Richard and I planted 30 years earlier, its branches stretching over the driveway like a familiar pair of arms. I saw the narrow crack in the walkway where Gregory once tripped as a boy and scraped his knee. I saw the pale blue shutters that Richard painted himself one summer afternoon. It was my house, and my belongings were outside it. I stepped out of the taxi slowly, feeling a strange heaviness in my chest. The driver asked politely if I needed help unloading the rest of my bags. I almost laughed at the question. Everything I owned was already waiting on the sidewalk. Rain clouds were gathering above the street when I noticed an envelope tucked under the handle of the largest suitcase. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Vanessa's handwriting always looked hurried, the letters leaning forward like they were impatient to reach the end of the sentence. I opened the note and read it once, then again. If you want to stay here, we have the garage. Your loving daughter-in-law. There are moments in life when reality becomes so strange that your mind refuses to move forward. Instead of reacting, you pause inside the moment itself, almost like someone pressing a finger against a photograph and asking how it was taken. I stood there on the sidewalk for what felt like a very long time. I had lived in that house for 35 years. Richard and I built it together when Gregory was still a baby who cried every night at 2 in the morning. Every wall had been painted by our own hands. Every tree in the yard had been planted by us. That house had watched our son grow into a man. It had watched him fall in love, marry, and bring his daughter home from the hospital wrapped in a pink blanket. It had also watched my husband take his final breath in the upstairs bedroom 2 years earlier. And now I was standing outside it like a visitor who had arrived too early. Before the taxi even pulled away, I took out my phone and called the bank. That may sound like a strange reaction, but when you reach a certain age you learn something important. Emotions can wait, but numbers rarely lie. The woman from the mortgage department confirmed what I already suspected. The payment of $1,867 had left my account the previous Friday, just as it had every month for the last 2 years. The rain began falling just after I ended the call. Large drops landed on the pavement around my suitcases, darkening the concrete in uneven circles. I remember thinking how strange it was that the sky seemed to understand the weight of the moment before I did. I picked up the note again and read the words slowly. If you want to stay here, we have the garage. A garage. 35 years of living in a house reduced to a corner of concrete behind it. If this is your first time here, welcome to Empathetic Story. I'm glad you're listening. Stories like this are not easy to tell, but they often reveal something deeper about the quiet battles people fight inside their own families. If you believe stories about resilience and dignity deserve to be heard, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories alive and gives this small corner of the internet the encouragement it needs to keep sharing them. Now let me take you back to that afternoon because what happened next is where the real story begins. I walked around the side of the house toward the garage. The door was unlocked. Inside, someone had prepared a small space as if it were meant to look considerate. A narrow mattress leaned against the wall. A tiny lamp sat on a nightstand beside it. My clothes hung on a portable rack. The rest of my life, books, photographs, and letters, had been placed in cardboard boxes carefully labeled in Vanessa's handwriting. Mom's stuff. I sat down on the mattress and looked through the small window toward the backyard. I could see the patch of grass where Gregory once chased fireflies during summer evenings, while Richard grilled hamburgers on the patio. My phone buzzed with a message. It was from Gregory. "Mom, we need the space. Vanessa has been asking for a home office for months. The garage apartment has everything you need. Please don't make this difficult. Don't make this difficult." Those 4 words echoed in my mind as the rain tapped against the garage roof. I had spent 2 years after Richard's death trying not to be a burden. I stayed quiet when furniture was rearranged. I stayed quiet when my belongings slowly disappeared into storage boxes. I stayed quiet when conversations about senior communities started appearing around the dinner table. But sitting there in that garage, surrounded by the fragments of my life, I realized something that would change everything. When you spend too long trying not to inconvenience the people you love, eventually they stop seeing you at all. And that was the moment I made the first decision that would lead to everything that followed. I picked up my phone and called my oldest friend. "Martha," I said when she answered. She heard something in my voice immediately. "Audrey," she asked gently, "what happened?" I looked at the boxes around me, at the mattress beneath me, and at the rain sliding down the small garage window. "I need somewhere to stay," I told her. "They've put me in the garage." Martha arrived 20 minutes later, just as she promised, and the moment she stepped into that dim garage I understood something I hadn't fully realized until then. Sometimes the people who truly see you are not the ones who share your last name. She didn't ask many questions at first. She simply hugged me, helped load my suitcases into her car and drove me away from the house I had called home for 35 years. I watched the place disappear in the rearview mirror without saying a word. It's strange how quiet a person can become when something inside them has cracked. That first night at Martha's house, I slept in her spare bedroom. The bed was smaller than mine had been, the furniture mismatched, and the window looked out over a narrow alley instead of a backyard. But when I woke up the next morning, sunlight was pouring through the curtains, and for the first time since I'd returned home, I felt something that resembled safety. Martha was already in the kitchen making coffee when I walked in. She turned around, studied my face for a moment, and asked the question that would slowly unravel the truth of everything. "Audrey," she said carefully, "are you still paying the mortgage on that house?" The question hung in the air like a loose thread waiting to be pulled. "Yes," I answered. Her eyebrows lifted. "How long?" "Since Richard died." She blinked. "That was 2 years ago." I nodded and wrapped my hands around the warm mug she slid toward me. "Now let me tell you something honestly, because I have had a lot of time to think about this since that morning. When people hear a story like mine, they often assume that the cruelty appeared suddenly. That one day everything was normal, and the next day someone packed your belongings into boxes and pushed you into a garage. But that isn't how these things usually happen. Disrespect grows quietly. It begins with small changes that feel too insignificant to challenge. After Richard passed away, Gregory and Vanessa were struggling financially. They had a new baby, bills piling up, and the kind of stress that makes young families feel like they are drowning. I wanted to help. Not because they asked me to, because I was his mother. I had signed the house over to Gregory shortly after Richard's funeral. At the time it felt like the right thing to do. I told myself it would make his future more secure, give him stability, help him build a life with his daughter. But what Gregory didn't know was that the mortgage payments never stopped coming from my account. Every month. $1,867. 26 payments in total by the time I returned from that trip. Martha listened quietly while I explained all of this. Finally she leaned back in her chair and shook her head. "Audrey," she said softly, "do they even know you're still paying for that house?" "I don't think they ever thought about it," I said. And that was the truth. Gregory had grown up in that house. He knew every corner of it, every loose stair, every creak in the hallway floor. But somewhere along the way he had stopped thinking about what it cost to keep a roof over it. Maybe that was my fault. When you protect someone from consequences for too long, they begin to believe the world simply works that way. Over the next hour I found myself telling Martha things I had been quietly carrying for months. How Vanessa had slowly taken control of the house after Richard died. How the furniture began moving without discussion. How my suggestions were dismissed with polite smiles that never reached her eyes. One afternoon she threw away Richard's fishing gear. When I asked why, she shrugged and said something that still stings when I remember it. "We need to move forward, Audrey. Not live in a museum." A museum. That's what my husband's memory had become to her. Looking back now, I can see how gradually everything changed. My reading chair moved to the basement. Family photographs disappeared from the mantel. Conversations about redecorating turned into conversations about modernizing. And then eventually conversations about how a senior community might be more comfortable for someone your age. Each step seemed small on its own, but together they formed a quiet path leading exactly where I had ended up. In the garage, Martha listened to all of this without interrupting. When I finally finished speaking, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You didn't deserve any of that," she said. I stared into my coffee. "The worst part," I admitted, "is that I let it happen." Martha shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "You tried to keep your family together." Maybe she was right. Or maybe the truth was more complicated. My phone buzzed on the table beside me. A message from Gregory. "Mom, when are you coming to get the rest of your things? We need to convert the garage for Emma's playroom." I read the message twice before setting the phone down. Emma's playroom. The words felt like a small stone dropping into still water. Martha saw the screen and her expression hardened. "That boy has some nerve," she muttered. But I wasn't angry in that moment. I was thinking about something else. Something that had been sitting quietly in the back of my mind since I called the bank the day before. If they were planning to turn the garage into a playroom, and if they were planning to move on with their lives without me, then what would happen if I simply stopped paying the mortgage? That question stayed with me long after the coffee had gone cold and the kitchen had grown quiet. What would happen if I simply stopped paying the mortgage? At first the thought felt almost disloyal, the way certain ideas do when they challenge the identity you've carried for most of your life. Mothers are supposed to protect their children. We are supposed to absorb the storms that come into their lives and make sure the wind never reaches them. For decades that belief had shaped every decision I made. But sitting in Martha's kitchen that morning, I realized something uncomfortable. Somewhere along the way, my role as Gregory's protector had slowly transformed into something else. I had become his safety net, his silent solution to problems he didn't even know existed. And the truth is, safety nets are invisible until the moment they disappear. That night I lay awake in the spare bedroom staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house settling into sleep. My mind replayed the last 2 years like an old film strip I had never bothered to examine closely before. Richard's funeral. Gregory's worried voice when he talked about bills. Vanessa explaining how expensive childcare had become. Every moment had seemed reasonable on its own. Every compromise had felt small enough to accept. But when you look back at a long line of compromises, you begin to see something different. You see the shape of your own disappearance. By the time the sun rose the next morning, something inside me had shifted. Not anger. Not revenge. Something steadier than that. Clarity. Martha was already awake when I came into the kitchen. She looked up from her newspaper and studied my face. "You've made a decision," she said. I sat down across from her and nodded. "I'm stopping the mortgage payments." She didn't react the way most people would expect. There was no gasp, no dramatic pause. She simply folded the newspaper and said, "About time." Later that afternoon she insisted I speak with her nephew Brian, a lawyer who lived across town. I wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea. Bringing lawyers into family conflicts feels like crossing a line you can never step back from. But Martha had a way of making difficult choices sound reasonable. "You don't have to start a war," she told me. "You just need to understand where you stand." Brian's office was smaller than I expected. Instead of the polished, intimidating law firm environment you see in movies, his space felt more like a professor's study. Bookshelves lined the walls, and a single desk sat beneath a window that overlooked a quiet street. He greeted me with a calm smile and asked me to tell the story from the beginning. As I spoke, he listened carefully, occasionally jotting notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and tapped his pen against the desk. "So," he said slowly, "let me make sure I understand this correctly. You transferred the title of the house to your son after your husband passed away." "Yes." "But you continued paying the mortgage yourself." "Yes." "And now they've moved you into the garage and are planning to sell the house." I nodded. Hearing the situation summarized out loud made it sound almost absurd. Brian looked thoughtful for a moment. You have options, he said. The words felt strange. Options were something I hadn't considered in a very long time. What kind of options? I asked. Well, he said, the simplest approach would be to sue for reimbursement of the mortgage payments you've made since the transfer. The word sue made my stomach tighten. That would take years, Martha said from the chair beside me. Brian nodded. It could. But there may be another path. He explained that financial arrangements like mine could sometimes create something called an equitable interest in a property. The legal details were complicated, but the idea was simple enough to understand. Because I had continued paying for the house, I might still have a claim connected to it. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was leverage. The word echoed in my mind as I drove home that evening. Leverage. For the first time since I found my suitcases on the sidewalk, I realized the situation might not be as hopeless as it had seemed. Still, there was something I needed to do before involving lawyers or legal documents. I needed to look my son in the eye. The next afternoon I drove back to the house. The house I had once entered freely now required me to stand on the porch and press the doorbell like a visitor. It was a small detail, but it carried an unexpected weight. Vanessa opened the door. Her smile appeared quickly, the way people smile when they're surprised but trying not to show it. Audrey, she said, we weren't expecting you. I need to speak with Gregory. She hesitated for a second before stepping aside. Of course. The living room had changed again since I'd last seen it. The reading lamp Richard bought during a trip to Maine had disappeared, replaced by a tall metal floor lamp that looked like something from a furniture catalog. Family photographs had been rearranged on the mantel. Several of Richard's pictures were missing. Gregory walked in from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. Mom, he said, frowning slightly. What are you doing here? I came to talk about the house. Vanessa and Gregory exchanged a glance. Martha told me you're planning to sell it, I said. Gregory shifted uncomfortably. We were going to tell you. When? When everything was finalized. Finalized. The word hung in the air. This house was my home for 35 years, I said quietly. Vanessa sighed as if the conversation was already exhausting her. Audrey, we understand you have sentimental attachments, but we have to think about what's best for our family. Your family. The phrase felt sharp in my ears. And what am I? I asked. Gregory stepped forward. Mom, you signed the house over to us. Legally it belongs to us now. I took a slow breath. I've been paying the mortgage. Silence filled the room. Every month, I continued. For the last 2 years. Vanessa spoke first. That was your decision. My hands trembled slightly, but my voice remained calm. I did it because that's what family does. Gregory shrugged. You're making this more dramatic than it needs to be. Then he said something I will probably remember for the rest of my life. The house was Dad's gift to me, he said. It was never really yours. 35 years of memories collapsed into 5 words. Never really yours. In that moment something inside me finally broke free from the quiet patience I had carried for so long. I stopped the mortgage payments, I said. Gregory's expression changed instantly. You did what? If you want to sell the house, I replied, you'll have to start paying for it yourselves. For the first time since the conversation began, neither Gregory nor Vanessa had anything to say. And as I turned to leave the house that had once been mine, I realized something important. I wasn't invisible anymore. The silence that followed my words in that living room told me something had shifted, even if none of us fully understood it yet. I left the house without waiting for their response. The air outside felt cooler than before, and as I walked down the driveway I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to in years. The sound of my own footsteps. For a long time I had moved quietly through that house, trying not to disturb anyone, trying not to create tension, trying not to become a problem that needed solving. But that afternoon I walked away without lowering my voice or softening my steps. When I arrived back at Martha's house, she was waiting in the kitchen with Brian. The moment I walked in they both looked up. Well? Martha asked. I set my purse down slowly. I told them I stopped the mortgage payments. Martha's eyebrows lifted with satisfaction. Brian, on the other hand, leaned back in his chair and studied my expression carefully. And how did they react? He asked. Shock, I said. Good, Martha replied immediately. Brian smiled faintly, but then his tone shifted into the calm seriousness of someone who had seen situations like this unfold many times before. Stopping the payments changes the dynamic, he said. But we need to be careful about what comes next. He pulled out a folder and spread several documents across the table. Here's what's likely happening right now, he continued. Your son probably believes the missed payment is a temporary mistake. Once the bank contacts him, the reality will become clearer. What reality? I asked. That mortgages come with responsibilities, Brian said simply. Over the next half hour he explained how the situation would likely unfold. A missed payment would begin affecting Gregory and Vanessa's credit score. If the payments continued to lapse, the bank could eventually begin foreclosure proceedings. But there was another layer to the situation that I hadn't fully understood yet. Brian tapped one of the documents. Because you've been making consistent payments on a property you no longer legally own, he said, you may have established what's known as an equitable lien. The term sounded technical and distant. What does that actually mean? I asked. It means you may have a financial claim connected to that house, he said. If they attempt to sell it, your contribution would have to be addressed first. Martha leaned forward. So they can't just take the money and walk away? Not without dealing with Audrey's claim, Brian said. For the first time since I found my suitcases on the sidewalk, a small sense of balance returned to the situation. I wasn't powerless. I had simply forgotten that I had power. The next morning my phone started ringing before I even finished breakfast. Gregory's name appeared on the screen. I watched it ring for a moment before letting it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. And again. By the third call I knew the bank had already reached him. Later that afternoon a text message appeared. Mom, the bank called about the mortgage. We need to talk. The words were urgent, but I didn't respond immediately. For 2 years I had been available whenever Gregory needed something. If he had a question I answered it. If he had a problem I tried to solve it. But that pattern had created the situation we were now living in. So I finished my coffee. Then I did something else. On my walk back from Brian's office the previous day, I had passed a small cafe called Rosie's. It sat on the corner of a quiet street with large windows and a faded red sign that had probably hung there for decades. In the window was a small handwritten sign. Help wanted. The idea had stayed in the back of my mind all night. Now I know what some people might be thinking. Why would a 68-year-old woman apply for a waitressing job? But let me tell you something that many people don't realize until later in life. There is a kind of dignity that comes from earning even a small amount of money with your own hands. After Richard died, I had slowly allowed my world to shrink. My days revolved around the house, around Gregory's schedule, around trying not to interfere with the lives of people who seemed increasingly irritated by my presence. Working again meant something different. It meant independence. So I walked into Rosie's cafe and asked if they needed help. 2 days later, Rosa, the owner, handed me an apron and showed me where the coffee cups were kept. My first shift was exhausting. My feet ached from standing. My back protested every tray I carried across the dining room. But when I counted the tips in my apron pocket at the end of the day, something inside me felt alive again. For years my financial contributions had been invisible, quietly transferred from my bank account into the mortgage of a house that no longer welcomed me. But the dollar bills I earned at Rosie's felt different. They were mine. A few days later, as I carried a tray of coffee cups across the cafe floor, I noticed a familiar figure standing near the hostess stand. Gregory. He looked uncomfortable standing there, as if the simple act of entering the cafe had disrupted the image he had of how my life should look. Mom, he said when I approached. Rosa glanced over from behind the counter. Take 15 minutes if you need to, she said kindly. I led Gregory to a small booth near the window. He looked at me carefully. You look different, he said. I am different, I replied. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Mom, we're in trouble. I waited. The bank says there's something called a lien connected to the house, he continued. And our credit score is already dropping because of the missed payment. I listened quietly. Then he said the words that told me he still didn't fully understand what had changed. We need you to resume the mortgage payments, he said. Just until we can sell the house. For a moment I almost laughed. After everything that had happened, after the garage and the boxes and the note on my suitcase, he still believed the solution was simply for me to continue paying. "And what happens to me?" I asked. Gregory frowned slightly. "We'll make sure you're taken care of," he said. "There's a really nice senior community in Westbrook." I raised my hand gently. "Stop." He fell silent. Then I said something I had never said to my son before. "I'm not interested in being taken care of." Gregory stared at me. "Mom, be reasonable." "No," I said quietly. "I think this is the first time I actually am." He leaned back in his seat, frustrated. "What do you want then?" The answer had been forming in my mind since the moment Brian explained the word leverage. "I want my home back," I said. The moment those words left my mouth in that quiet booth at Rosie's cafe, I knew the path forward would not be simple. Gregory stared at me as if I had just spoken in a language he had never heard before. "What do you mean your home?" he asked. "The house on Maple Avenue," I said calmly. "But that house is ours," he replied. I didn't argue with him then. There was no point having that conversation across a sticky cafe table, while customers walked past carrying plates of pancakes. Instead, I took a breath and said something that surprised even me. "If you want to discuss this seriously," I told him, "meet me at Brian Wallace's office tomorrow at 2. Gregory hesitated, glancing around the cafe as if suddenly aware of the life I had built outside the house he believed I had abandoned. "You're bringing lawyers into this?" he asked. "No," I said quietly. "You did that the moment you put my suitcases on the sidewalk." He didn't answer. But the next afternoon he showed up. Vanessa came with him. They arrived at Brian's office precisely at 2 o'clock, dressed as if they were attending a business negotiation rather than a conversation about family. Gregory wore a pressed shirt and an expensive watch that caught the light whenever he moved his hands. Vanessa carried a leather folder tucked under her arm, her posture straight and composed. Brian greeted them politely and invited everyone to sit. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of traffic outside the window. "Thank you for coming," Brian began calmly. "Mrs. Wilson has considered your request regarding the mortgage payments." Vanessa leaned forward immediately. "We appreciate that," she said smoothly. "We're sure we can reach a solution that works for everyone." Brian nodded and slid a document across the desk. "This is Mrs. Wilson's proposal." Gregory picked up the paper first. I watched his eyes move quickly across the page. Then his expression changed. Confusion, disbelief, and finally anger. "What is this?" he asked. "That," I said, keeping my voice steady, "is my condition." Vanessa leaned over and took the document from him. She read it more slowly, her eyebrows drawing together as she reached the final line. "You want us to sell you the house?" she said. "Yes." "For the remaining mortgage balance?" "Yes." Her voice sharpened. "That house is worth 3 times that amount." I nodded. "It's worth exactly what I have invested in it. 35 years of mortgage payments. 35 years of repairs and improvements. And the 26 payments that continued quietly leaving my account even after the house was no longer legally mine." Gregory pushed the paper across the desk. "You can't be serious." Brian folded his hands calmly. "Because of the equitable lien connected to the mortgage payments," he explained. "Any sale of the property would require resolving Mrs. Wilson's financial contribution first." Vanessa's composure began to crack. "We'll get another lawyer," she said quickly. "That is certainly your right," Brian replied. "However, legal proceedings could take considerable time." "How much time?" Gregory asked. "Months," Brian said. "Possibly longer." Vanessa exhaled sharply. Gregory leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead. "You planned this," he said quietly, looking at me. The accusation hung in the room for a moment. I shook my head. "No," I said. "I simply stopped allowing myself to be used. Sometimes people expect justice to arrive with anger or revenge. But the truth is, justice often looks much quieter than that. Justice is simply the moment a person decides their dignity is no longer negotiable." Vanessa stood suddenly. "We need a minute," she said. Brian nodded toward the hallway. Gregory and Vanessa stepped outside the office. Through the glass wall I could see them arguing in hushed voices. Vanessa spoke rapidly. gesturing with her hands while Gregory stood still, staring at the floor. For the first time since this entire situation began, they looked uncertain. Brian glanced at me. "You're handling this with remarkable restraint," he said. "I'm not sure restraint is the right word," I replied softly. "It's simply the only path that still lets me sleep at night. Fighting strangers is easy. Fighting your own child is something else. Entirely." After several minutes, the office door opened again. Gregory and Vanessa walked back inside. Their expressions had changed. The confidence was gone. In its place was resignation. Gregory sat down slowly. "We'll accept your offer," he said. Vanessa didn't speak, but her silence confirmed the decision. Brian nodded and began discussing the legal steps required to complete the transaction. The conversation turned into paperwork, signatures, timelines, but I barely heard any of it. Instead, I watched my son. He looked older somehow, tired. And when Brian finished explaining the final steps, Gregory said something that revealed how differently we understood the moment. "I hope you realize what this means for our relationship," he said quietly. I met his eyes. "I do," he replied. "And I hope someday you realize what it meant when you left my suitcases on the sidewalk." No one spoke after that. 3 months later, the legal process was complete. The house on Maple Avenue belonged to me again. Not as a gift, not as a favor, but as something I had reclaimed. The evening I received the final paperwork, I drove slowly down the familiar street toward the place where most of my life had unfolded. The maple tree in the yard still cast its long shadow across the driveway. The crack in the walkway was still there. And when I reached the front door, I did something I hadn't done in months. I took out my key, turned the lock, and stepped back into my home. And yet, when the door finally closed behind me that evening, I realized reclaiming the house was only part of what had truly happened. The first night back inside felt strangely unfamiliar, even though every corner of the place carried memories I could trace with my eyes closed. I walked slowly through the hallway, touching the walls the way someone might greet an old friend after a long separation. The paint had changed in some rooms and Vanessa's modern touches were still visible here and there. But beneath those surface details, the house still held the quiet heartbeat of the life Richard and I had built together. The staircase creaked exactly the same way it always had on the third step. The hallway floor still tilted slightly toward the window, something Richard used to promise he would fix next summer. And when the evening sunlight slipped through the bay window in the living room, it created the same golden square on the carpet where Gregory used to sit and build his towers of toy blocks. That night I didn't rush to unpack anything. I simply moved from room to room, letting the silence settle around me. A house that once held the noise of a family can feel almost sacred when it grows quiet again. Eventually I found myself standing in the bedroom Richard and I had shared for decades. The furniture had been moved around while Gregory and Vanessa lived there, but the room still carried the same feeling of calm that had always drawn me back to it at the end of long days. I stood by the window and looked out at the backyard. For a moment, I could almost see Richard standing near the old oak tree, holding the garden hose while Gregory ran barefoot across the grass chasing fireflies. "I'm home," I whispered. The words were meant for him, though I knew only the quiet air of the room would hear them. The following morning the doorbell rang. For a split second my heart tightened, but when I opened the door it was Martha standing there with a large pot balanced in one hand and a bottle of wine in the other. "Housewarming," she announced as she walked past me into the kitchen without waiting for an invitation. Though technically it's more of a homecoming. I laughed for the first time in what felt like months. I think both descriptions are accurate. She set the pot down and began examining the kitchen with the critical eye of someone who had known the house nearly as long as I had. "Good heavens," she said, running a hand along one of the cabinets. "She painted over your oak." "Yes," I replied. "Apparently gray is modern." Martha snorted. "You know what else is modern? Throwing people out of houses they built." We both laughed, though beneath the humor there was still a bruise that hadn't fully faded. Over the next few weeks, life began to settle into a rhythm that felt new and familiar at the same time. Mornings were spent working at Rosie's Cafe, where Rosa insisted I was now part of the permanent family. Afternoons were devoted to small projects around the house. Nothing dramatic, just quiet acts of restoration. I brought back warm colors in the living room, returned family photographs to the mantel, and hung Richard's fishing rods in the den where they belonged. The house slowly began to feel like mine again. One Saturday morning while I was kneeling in the front yard planting tulip bulbs, a car pulled into the driveway. I didn't need to look up to know whose car it was. Gregory stepped out and stood near the edge of the garden, watching me brush soil from my hands. "The flowers look nice," he said. I nodded. "Your father loved tulips." Gregory glanced toward the yard, as if the memories there made him uncomfortable. I remember him planting them every fall. For a moment we simply stood there in the quiet space between us. Then Gregory cleared his throat. "We didn't get the house in Oakwood Hills," he said. I wasn't surprised. The missed mortgage payments and credit complications had likely made that dream impossible. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. "We found an apartment instead," he continued. "It's smaller than we expected." He paused, shifting his weight. "Vanessa is pregnant again." The news settled softly in my chest. "Congratulations," I said. Gregory nodded. "Emma asks about you sometimes." A gentle ache moved through me at the mention of my granddaughter. "She's always welcome here," I said. "So are you." Gregory looked at me carefully, as if weighing something he hadn't quite decided how to say. "Mom, I still think you chose the house over your family." His words didn't surprise me. In many ways they confirmed something I had already accepted. I met his eyes. "No," I said quietly. "I chose not to be erased." He didn't respond. Perhaps he didn't understand yet. Perhaps he would someday. Some lessons take time to settle into the heart. That evening Martha came over again, this time bringing Jim along with a couple of friends from the cafe. We sat in the backyard as the sky turned orange and then deep blue, sharing food and stories in the same place where Gregory once celebrated his high school graduation. At one point Martha raised her glass. "A toast," she said, "to Audrey Wilson. To the woman who reminded all of us that it's never too late to reclaim your life." Everyone clinked their glasses, and I felt something warm spread through my chest. Later that night, after the house grew quiet again, I sat alone on the porch swing listening to the familiar creaks and sighs of the place settling into the dark. For years I had believed that losing my husband meant losing the life we built together. But sitting there beneath the same stars Richard used to point out on summer nights, I realized something I wish more people understood sooner. A house can hold your memories, but your dignity, your voice, your sense of self, those things belong only to you. And once you reclaim them, no one can ever move you into the garage again. I hadn't just taken back the house on Maple Avenue. I had taken back my place in my own life. Looking back on everything that happened, I sometimes realize that the most painful moments in life are not the ones where we lose something. They are the moments where we begin to lose ourselves without noticing it. For a long time after my husband passed away, I believed that keeping the peace in my family meant making myself smaller. I believed that being patient, being quiet, and constantly giving would protect the people I loved and keep our family together. But life has a quiet way of revealing difficult truths. Love without boundaries slowly turns into sacrifice without dignity. When we keep adjusting ourselves to avoid conflict, people can start to treat our kindness as something permanent and unquestioned. The real turning point in my story was not the legal process, the mortgage, or even the house itself. It was the moment I realized that my voice still mattered. The moment I understood that respecting yourself is not selfish. It is necessary. Taking back my home was only the visible part of the story. The deeper victory was remembering who I was and refusing to disappear from my own life. If there is one lesson I hope people take from this story, it is this: kindness should never require you to erase yourself. Supporting your family is a beautiful thing, but support should exist alongside respect. When you notice that your voice, your needs, or your dignity are slowly being pushed aside, that is the moment to pause and speak honestly. Setting boundaries does not destroy relationships. In many cases, it is the only thing that can save them from resentment and silence. In your own life, today this may mean having a difficult conversation, reclaiming something you quietly gave up, or simply remembering that your value does not disappear just because others stop noticing it. Now I'm curious to hear from you. In your opinion, was Audrey right to stop paying the mortgage and take back her home? Or should she have handled the situation differently? Please share your thoughts politely in the comments section so everyone can read and learn from different perspectives. And if stories like this resonate with you, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps Empathetic Story continue sharing meaningful stories that remind us of the strength, dignity, and quiet courage people carry within their everyday lives.